Sometimes it seems like people just don't care about climate change. But then I got to thinking, maybe a lot of people do actually care. Maybe it's just that they express themselves in different ways than I do. And so I wanted to talk about how climate change is a wicked problem, and how we all view the problem in different ways and we express our concern in different ways. So what is a wicked problem? A wicked problem is a problem with no clear or agreed upon problem definition. The solutions feed back into the problem definition. There's incomplete knowledge of the problem, and if it's a super wicked problem, the problem evolves and becomes more difficult to solve as time goes on. So there's a lot of freedom to really see the problem how you want to see it. So if we take a look at this illustration, the three witches down here are all viewing the problem of climate change very differently. The wicked witch on the left is talking about greenhouse gases. The witch in the middle is talking about oil production and policy. And the witch on the right is too uncomfortable to even talk about the conversation. And this kind of reflects my bias. I see it more as a social problem. But a wicked problem doesn't mean that we just throw our hands up in the air and say we can't do anything about this. It means we can manage this in a collaborative way. So here's the first definition of how you can frame climate change. So it's a greenhouse gas problem. And it's true, it is a greenhouse gas problem, except it's not exclusively a greenhouse gas problem. And so if you only frame it as a greenhouse gas problem, this has some serious implications because it doesn't really mesh well with our psychology. So if you think that climate change is only a greenhouse gas problem, this implies that you have to do personal action to solve the problem. And to do that, we have to make personal sacrifices. Well, guess what? Nobody wants to make personal sacrifices. Now, there's a few people that are going to do something about it, and they're going to take personal action, but most likely than not, they're not actually making a sacrifice. They're doing it because it strengthens their identity, and they feel good about doing it, which is great. Keep doing it if you are. But this doesn't work for the masses. We need collective action here. And there's also the single action bias. So if I say, okay, I'm going to do my part, I'm going to turn off my lights. Well, that's great. Keep doing it. Turn off your lights. But this isn't nearly enough of what we need to do to solve this problem. But every little bit does help. And this is how scientists have framed the problem, because this is the realm of science. We have to understand how are the greenhouse gases affecting the climate system. So scientists talk about this, because if they talked about it in other ways, they would be kind of diverting from the realm of what's science. They would be moving into the policy area, and scientists don't like to do that. So the other thing this does is it distributes the blame across all of us. And so it's the classic tragedy of the commons problem. We don't like to feel that we're responsible for this either. And so this kicks off a bunch of defense mechanisms like we've got avoidance, denial, discounting, like it's not really going to be that bad. Of course, that's not what the experts say. And corporations are also pretty content with this perception, because if we put the blame on ourselves, then it means that they don't really have to do a whole lot. So framing climate change as a greenhouse gas problem is probably the most common perception, but it's incomplete and it has a lot of drawbacks. Okay, so the next way to frame the problem is of the wellhead and the tailpipe. So if you only look at climate change from a greenhouse gas perspective, you're only focusing on the tailpipe. But look, this is supply and demand. We can't just only focus on the demand. And so if you focus on the supply side, there's actually just 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of the emissions. And so rather than distributing the blame over absolutely everyone in the world, we could actually get the CEOs from those 100 companies in a room, and we can talk about how do we solve this. So like all people, these companies kind of have their own cultures, and what they claim is that we give them permission to do what they're doing. Well, nobody asked me if I gave them permission, and I don't. And so it's something that they tell themselves, because look, this Bill McKibben wrote a couple of articles a few years back. So this 2012 article he wrote, Global Warming's Terrifying New Math. This is the article that I read that really got me interested in this topic. And he says that if we burn 20% of the known fossil fuel reserves, we'll have an 80% chance of staying under this 2 degrees Celsius goal. And so to me, climate change used to be a distant problem that wasn't really going to affect me. This really put it in the present for me, because this is saying that we have this really small window and it's slipping away. Like the world isn't taking this goal seriously. And if we don't do anything about this in the next few years, we're going to miss this 2 degree goal. He did a follow-up article in 2016 like Recalculating the Climate Math or something like that in the New Republic, and basically said that if we burn 85% of the currently operating production sites, we're going to have a 2/3 chance of staying under 2 degrees Celsius. So really, there is not much time to waste here. And companies, like, why are they even building new infrastructure? Why do we have the Keystone Pipeline and the DAPL pipeline? The age of fossil fuel infrastructure is over. If we're serious about staying under this 2 degrees Celsius goal, there's no reason to do it. And all this exploration they want to do in the Arctic, we don't need new fossil fuel reserves. We have to find a way to transition off of this, or we're going to have the consequences of going over 2 degrees. So this really, this puts it in the present for me. And I like this way of looking at the problem a little bit better because it takes the blame off us. I think that's an important part for our psychology. We don't want to blame ourselves. This isn't our fault. We live in this society. These are the constraints that we have to deal with, and we just all need to do our part to move off of this. So if corporations aren't willing to sacrifice their profits and individuals aren't willing to make personal sacrifices, then we need to use policy to be able to change people's behavior. So the types of policy here surrounding climate change are command and control. This would be something like the Clean Power Plan, where the government sets regulations. We have cap and trade. This was the solution that we used to solve acid rain. So it was actually a pretty similar situation to this now back in the 1980s, where conservatives were actually kind of opposed to accepting the acid rain problem. And so we didn't do anything about it during the Reagan era until George W. Bush suggested that we use cap and trade. And this was a policy that was compatible with conservative values, and Democrats took a little bit of convincing, but eventually they accepted that they wanted to try this, and it was extremely successful. So if we can get a policy that sort of works for all sides, we can really solve these type of problems. We tried cap and trade again. This was the Waxman-Markey bill. It ended up passing the House, but it didn't pass the Senate. It was this big 1,400-page monstrosity that had a whole bunch of special interests written into it, and it just didn't work out for climate change. But there is another solution, and that's the carbon tax. So if you make this revenue neutral, it's not perfect, but it's pretty compatible with conservative ideology. And I think we need something like this, where a solution that works for all sides. And that's really the only way we're going to advance on solving an issue that's really become a hot button political issue. I mean, politics really comes down to ideologies and economics and fairness. And if we can't solve a problem that's this important, it's just like our country just doesn't even work anymore. So climate change is also a social problem. So there's another aspect of politics, and that's group identity. So if you think that climate change is just for liberal environmentalists and you don't identify as an environmentalist, then you're going to be kind of like, it's not really my thing. But that's a big misconception, because this is for all of us. So if you're a resident of planet Earth, this is your problem. There's also this instinct that we have to want to conform to the actions of our social group, whether or not they're right or wrong. And this is what psychologists would call social proof. And this really affected me and how I think of climate change. So when I was younger, there were times when there would be warm weeks during the winter, and I'd get a little bit worried about, is this climate change? But there wasn't really a reaction from people around me. I didn't have the social cues saying, I should worry about this. And so soon my worry passed, and I went back to life as normal. It wasn't until I was a little bit older and I started reading about, climate change and having this constant stream of information coming in that really kind of made it click for me. And so this is sort of the socially constructed silence. There's this social proof that we're not supposed to really even talk about climate change. So even in some social circles, it goes a little bit farther than that. It's really, you're not supposed to even care about this issue. And so this picture down here, this is a scene from The Emperor's New Clothes. This is what psychologists would call pluralistic ignorance. So everyone knows that the emperor's not wearing clothes, except that everyone thinks that everyone else thinks that the emperor is wearing clothes. And so when we talk about climate change, the pluralistic ignorance comes in, and the percentage of people that we think don't even accept it. So it's about 20% of the U.S. population that doesn't accept it, and it's a little bit higher in conservative Republicans. It's about 50%. But people tend to think this is much higher, and that sort of feeds back into the social proof of, it's not my thing. I don't really need to care about this. And we can measure how many people care and how people are concerned about climate change. There's public opinion polls. They show that people don't really bring up climate change unless prompted when asked what the biggest problems are. There was barely any coverage even during the election. You know, you think this is the biggest problem we've ever faced. We should be talking about this during our election. And I think George Shultz brought it up at the Republican debate, and Bernie Sanders mentioned it a couple of times at the Democratic debate. But other than that, there was really nothing. And you know, it's barely talked about on TV. So yeah, it's a big problem that people aren't talking about this. And another interesting thing happens, kind of like going back to that first slide with the witch on the right that was uncomfortable talking about it because of the socially constructed silence. If you start passionately talking about climate change in front of a group, the conversation will be deflected. It's kind of a weird phenomenon that happens. I've experienced it. I've read about it. It's something we need to change. So social psychologists say if we can get about 10% of the population talking about climate change, then we can change these social norms, and sort of our instincts will take care of the rest. And that's when I think we're gonna get about solving this problem. So our political identities aren't our entire identity. So Dan Kahan, a psychology professor at Yale, I provided a link to his paper down below, discovered that there's another segment of the population which he labels the scientifically curious. So these are people who are able to read the science. They try to suppress their bias as much as possible as they're reading it. And regardless of political ideology, they can actually, they're more likely to care about climate change. You know, whether they're Republican, Democrat, doesn't really matter. And so I tend to think that the solution to this is just talking about it. We're going to fix this once we get motivated to fix it, and everybody's okay with this topic. So let's talk briefly about why this is important. So 2 degrees, that goal that I keep talking about, it's an aggressive goal, but it's a little bit arbitrary. So the safe level, we already passed in the 1990s. That's 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this 2 degrees is going to have consequences, but it's still manageable. So there's the possibility that coral reefs could go extinct, even if we meet this goal. And that's going to affect the food security of hundreds of millions of people. This isn't just some environmental concern. This is going to affect every single one of us. And we're currently on a trajectory for 4 degrees. And we don't want this to happen. This could possibly mean environmental, economic, and societal collapse. And this could happen sometime around 2070. This isn't the future that will happen. This is the future that could happen if we don't start doing something about this. And I think we need to have this conversation. We need to all be talking about this and getting this to be like a priority in our country. Because America has a lot of economic influence throughout the world. And if we can do this here, we can make big changes throughout the world. And of course, there's the emotional impacts, which are, these affect people like myself right now. Climate scientists and activists like myself are, who are up on this and who, I guess, constantly read this type of material. It's a tough thing to deal with, and I feel like I need to be doing something about this. I can't just know about this bystander effect that's going on and do nothing. To summarize, there's really a lot of flexibility in how we perceive climate change. So we all tend to see reality through our own narrow lens. And we talked a little bit about how mainly the problem of climate change is viewed as just exclusively a greenhouse gas problem and how that has certain deficits to it. If we want to get a more comprehensive view of climate change, we have to incorporate all these different components. So we've got the wellhead and the tailpipe. This is supply and demand. That's a more comprehensive way to view it because it's those 2 components. Climate change is also a political problem because in order to change people's behaviors, we need policy. And it's also a social problem because in order to get that policy, we need people to be motivated to want that policy. To keep things short, I just wanted to mention a couple more briefly here. It's also a technological problem. The technology is advancing so quickly, but it's not happening fast enough. We're headed for a renewable energy future, but if we want to be able to mitigate these effects that are going to happen if we cross this 2-degree threshold, we need to speed that up. And we can do that with policy. Policy will accelerate this technological development. We just need to want it. It's also a scientific issue, right? There's things that we know, there's things that we know that we don't know, and there's things that we just don't know. So the flexibility in how we perceive climate change allows us to emphasize these different aspects of it. But we know enough that we need to act. And it's also a moral issue. Climate change is really going to impact the poor and the vulnerable the most. Moral leaders like the Pope have written an encyclical that really emphasizes this aspect. And so climate change really is a moral issue, even if not everyone's really accepted that yet. So in conclusion, unfortunately, no one can tell you how to view climate change. You just have to figure it out for yourself. This is your chance. After this, there's no turning back. If you take the red pill, you wake up in your bed. You believe whatever you want to believe. If you take the blue pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep this rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is a more comprehensive version of the truth, nothing more.